Hi there, and welcome back. This is Megan Mitchell, the founder of Agents of Change Continuing Education. And today, our clinical conversation is going to be around the art of group therapy with kids. I will talk a little bit before we bring on our guest about just working with kids generally in groups. What are some considerations that you should have? What are some things you should think about when you're forming the group? Who would be a good group candidate? And then we'll be joined by a second time guest, Mariah Peloso, and she is a licensed clinical social worker. She works in schools and she also has her own private practice. So we will be picking her brain about how she has run groups specifically in the school setting. But before we touch base with Mariah, I wanted to just give a broad overview of so you're thinking of running a group with kiddos, or maybe you're in a setting where that is an expectation of your job. I was a school social worker for many years, and you had to run groups mostly because for time purposes, instructional time purposes, it was the best way to get multiple children together in a short amount of time. So let's go ahead and jump into our content. So, group therapy, it's pretty self explanatory what it is, but why would a client benefit from this modality? So, we're going to specifically focus on children. And it's a form of psychotherapy. It does have a clinical component here where either one therapist, there could be more than one therapist if you're co leading this, treat a group of clients together. The group number can vary. That depends on a lot of different things. I have had a group of two, I've had a group of six. All depends on a variety of things. And why would someone be in group therapy? Those who are in the group often have a common issue, a common presenting problem, or a common goal that they're working on. And the group setting allows it to be supportive and structured. So they might be benefiting from that time with other peers their age. They might be benefiting from learning a particular skill in the group setting because maybe it has a social component. So, why is this setting beneficial? Shared experiences. So, children get to share parts of their own experience, stories, and different problems from their own lives. They can get mutual support from the group members as well as from the group facilitator, and they can practice new skills in a social context. We know children and kids are social beings, so it's often a really great idea for a kiddo to be in a group setting if you are working on a skill that requires some sort of social context to it. Why could a group be beneficial? Mutual support, there's definitely that bonding aspect. It can be a supportive environment where participants are going to share their experiences. They might even ask the group to share their feedback. They might be finding that this is a place where there's others that are going to encourage them. There's others that are going through the same thing that they are, which can be really beneficial, especially if kids feel very isolated or they feel misunderstood or they are just really looking to find other people that are going through similar stuff as they are. Another advantage is you can develop skills here. There are some group modalities that are purely skill based. This might be a social skills group, or maybe it's a conflict resolution group, or a coping with anxiety group. There's a variety of different groups that can be run. But not only do you get to practice the skills, but you can reinforce them in this context. And it's a much lower stakes environment than just sending them out into a large group setting and having them utilize and practice these skills. It can be practiced in a safe, smaller setting first, build up the confidence to then go and use this skill in different settings. We've talked about this a little bit, but reduced isolation. So, kiddos might feel that, hey, there's other people out there that are going through the same thing I am. There's similar challenges. I have seen people run parents of divorce groups. There are grief groups if someone has lost a parent or a loved one. And just knowing that I'm not the only one experiencing this, that can be very powerful and that can be very therapeutic as it is as well. Perspective and feedback. Part of being in a group is that you have to listen to other people. So listening skills are really important, and being able to listen and take in diverse perspectives. So you might be with other people that don't necessarily see things the same way that you do, and you might be getting some sort of constructive feedback from group members. That can all be really helpful, and maybe that's a skill that this child is working towards. Efficiency, as someone that worked in a school setting, this was huge. And it was a time efficiency thing. I had a very large caseload. I could not possibly see all of the kids on my caseload one to one due to my own time constraints of the school day, and instructional time, right? There's certain times of the day they need to be in class learning. So it can really be a big time efficient way to see people. It also can be cost effective. So if you are working maybe in an agency setting or a private practice setting, you can see multiple clients at one time. So from you can reach multiple individuals in a shorter amount of time. Instead of seeing four clients for an hour individually, maybe I can see four clients for 45 minutes. So from a cost perspective, that is efficient. Also, on the part of the client, oftentimes groups are offered at a lower rate than individual therapy would be offered. So that could be an option for a client that is potentially hoping to get some sort of services, but for cost purposes, the group would be a better sell for them. So you're thinking of running a group. How do you prepare for this? You definitely need to prepare, and this is why I think a lot of people shy away from groups. There is startup time and resources and energy needed. You don't just show up one day and kind of wing it. There is preparation that is needed, and you got to be thinking about who's going to be in my group, what will this entail, how do I get people interested, how do I form the group. So, I'm going to go through some things that you should be thinking about if you are preparing to run a group. What are the conditions, right? What symptoms, what presenting problem am I going to run this group around? Is this a depression group? Is this a group for kiddos that are struggling in school? Is it a PTSD group? What is the goal of the group? Why are you running this? What are you hoping that participants will get out of this? And it's very important to think about, sometimes groups can be very beneficial from individuals who have been marginalized. Why is this? Because of that component we discussed, peer support and solidarity. I've been in schools where there were BIPOC focus groups for students. There was LGBTQ plus groups. So be thinking about, is there a particular benefit that potentially certain groups of people might gain from being part of group therapy that they would not get in an individual therapy setting. So you've done that, you've thought of the conditions. You also need to think about resources. What are you going to need to run the group? Does it require cost and materials? Where's the space going to be? Do you have a big enough space? Is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be in person? All things to think about when you are preparing for the group. Then you're also going to want to determine who would be a good fit for this. How would I know if someone's ready for a group? Group is not for everyone. So, would they be a good candidate? This is what you're going to have to think about clinically and assess for what you think for the particular group that you're running. What would be someone that would be a good candidate? I also, if you're working with kids, this might be talking to parents, talking to the kids themselves, talking to teachers, talking to others that might have a sense of if they would be a good candidate for group. Other things to consider, are they willing to participate? I never want to force a child to be part of a group. And if parents say, I really want them to be part of the group, but they're not really into it, we would have a discussion about that and what that might look like, what that might mean. Would they be comfortable in sharing, right? I don't want them to come to the group and they're getting no benefit, or they don't feel comfortable in sharing in the group. Would they be open to feedback, right? Some groups are merely for support, but there's other areas that they might be getting some feedback either from the facilitator or their peers. Addressing misconceptions. This is a big one that sometimes you have to explain to the potential client themselves, or if they are younger, you might have to explain it to the parents, right? What are the benefits of group therapy? What can they expect to get out of it? I would talk about confidentiality. We do our best to uphold confidentiality, but given that it's a group, we cannot guarantee it. Um, we do not ever want a client to disclose more than they're comfortable with. So I would talk about what those group norms are. I would talk about mandated reporting. I would talk about when confidentiality would need to be breached, whether that is a danger to self or a danger to others. So I would explain all of this ahead of time. And then I would talk about the safe and respectful environment that would be created for all participants and what that would look like. What will be the role of the facilitator? What are some of those ground rules? What is the tolerance if someone is not following the rules, type of thing? And then you definitely want to do some sort of pre orientation or pre group session programming. And this is where you might like have a pre meeting, a meeting with parents, a meeting with the client to just, maybe it's face to face that you meet them, or maybe you touch base with them virtually so that they can really understand and see if this would be the right fit for them. I have some people that are like, I'm not sure. Here, how about you come and meet me? You come and see the space and we can determine. You want to emphasize the supportive nature of the group, that it will be non-judgmental. I think a lot of people get scared. I don't want to do this. People are going to be critical of me. So just really helping a client understand what the purpose of the group is, what the nature of the group is going to be, discuss what the structure will look like. So if it's an hour, what's that hour going to look like? If it's in an hour and a half, what's that going to look like? What would be the group rules? Knowing that sometimes they are established once the group begins, but any fears that the client has or anything that may be getting in the way of them committing, have a discussion with them and really see if you're able to answer their questions. And then highlighting how beneficial you think it could be and why, right? Not just, I think you should do this because I think you should do it. Why do you think they should do it? They can be around peers. They can interact with others. This can be really helpful to build those lasting relationships. And then some of you might be leaning towards running groups in a virtual setting. A lot of kiddos, if you're in a school setting, are going to be doing this. They're going to be running groups in person, right? It's probably somewhere in the school building. If you're in a community agency, it might be in a community space somewhere within your agency. But there are still opportunities for virtual groups, and you need to be mindful of this as a potential group environment as well. So you need to think about who would be a good fit for a virtual group, right? I have some kiddos that thrive, they do great in the virtual setting. Others are like, I'm so burnt out from doing COVID school for all those years. I don't want to do virtual group or group virtual individual at all. So you need to think about these things. You need to consider these things. If you are thinking about running a virtual group, there are a few considerations that you need to think about. What might be any logistical issues? What are you going to do if internet connectivity becomes an issue? What if the client is glitching? What if they don't have access to stable connection? What if that's causing a disruption in the group setting? We all have, as adults, have been, for better or worse, in those meetings where the connection's not good, it's dropping, it can be very distracting, someone's off mute. So just think of these things as you're building out your technology for your potential virtual group. And then you also need to think about privacy concerns. When you're in a virtual setting, the privacy, we can't ensure at any point that that person is going to have the privacy, but are definitely going to encourage, make sure that there's no other people around you, explain what that would mean, make sure they are in a quiet space where there's not people walking around, it's not a public space, and make sure that any privacy concerns that you may have beforehand are addressed. You want to do that before you run the first group, because that could potentially get you into a situation where you got a bit of a mess on your hands because they are maybe in a public space and there's people walking by, and you need to think of HIPAA and you need to think of privacy concerns when you're running anything virtually. And also make sure that your software that you're using is HIPAA compliant as well. So make sure that is important as well. Your role, if you are running a virtual group, is you are going to have to be really on top of it. You're going to have to be very active because you are going to have to be jumping in and not only managing the group or facilitating the group, but making sure that virtually and from a technology standpoint everything's running smoothly. You're going to have to be flexible. So, hey, what if our internet drops off? What are we going to do? What is our backup plan? Are they going to have an adult come and help them? Are they going to call in from their phone? Like, what are the different pieces that you will need and to consider to be flexible in this group? And you're not going to have necessarily those physical cues. You're going to have to be reading it all via the virtual setting. So you need to make sure that you're, as the group facilitator, maintaining group cohesion to the best of your ability. And it's difficult, right? It's difficult too for a lot of times because maybe the kids aren't getting their physical cues. They're not picking up on the social cues. So, managing all of this is a lot of different skills that are needed from the therapist as well. Privacy and distractions, we've talked about privacy, but it's very important. And if you are working with kids, I even tell this to the parents what is needed for privacy to be upheld. So you want to set those ground rules ahead of time. Um, if you if you are recording, that needs to have they need to have consent for that. You need to have rules around not taking pictures or not sharing what happens in the group outside of the group. Discuss all of this. You probably would want to have some sort of agreement too that participants are signing to make sure that they're upholding these different ground rules as you are moving forward in the group. And you want to make sure, to the best of your ability, that confidentiality is ensured, but also letting people know you cannot 100% guarantee confidentiality due to the nature of this being a group. And there are some advantages to offering group in a virtual online setting. Some kids, some teens, some patients feel more comfortable. I've worked in schools, now I'm in private practice. Some of my teens prefer this. It works with their schedule. They're very, very busy. With parents, I mostly do all of my parenting calls and different touch points with parents virtually now. It makes a lot of sense. It's helpful for them. But some patients just feel more comfortable in their own home. I've done exposure therapy with kiddos virtually. That's been really helpful because they feel more comfortable, they feel safe in that setting, and they just may connect better in the virtual setting because that's really their world. That we have some kids that are super tech savvy, so that they just really feel confident and this is where they thrive. And they some people find the screen protective. I'm going to be more open in the virtual setting because I don't have to be as vulnerable as I would maybe necessarily have to be in an in-person setting. So these are just some things to think about. I have here below the citation of where this information came from. This was just a very broad overview of, if you're running a group with kids, here's some things to think about. Here's some different ways you can use this to your benefit. And then, of course, lastly, if you are moving into the direction of running a virtual group or a hybrid group, there are some groups that are also hybrid. Here's some things that you need to consider. So now, without further ado, we are going to transition and have our conversation with Mariah Peloso. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I'm very excited to have a repeat guest here today. We have Mariah Peloso here, and we're going to talk about group therapy. And there really is an art to it, and kind of how we have done groups in the past in schools, and what are some things to consider, and how can you gain confidence in running groups. So, Mariah, we're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So we'll get the housekeeping done and then we'll jump into our conversation. But let's do some quick introductions. My name is Megan Mitchell. I actually have just started my own private practice, Brain Space Wellness. A little bit about me. Obviously, I'm the founder of Agents of Change. I'm working towards my play therapy credential. I do a lot of work with children, so that makes sense that I do play therapy and expressive arts. Um, I a little bit about kind of my niches in my clinical practice. Tech and innovation. I've talked a lot about AI and how I use AI in my work. And then I'm also interested for my doctoral program in looking at multicultural supervision. How can we be culturally humble in our work in supervision with our supervisees? And then I'm currently a DSW student at SUNY Buffalo, and I have 2 more semesters left before I graduate. So I'm excited to see the finish line towards that. So it's a little bit about me, and let me tell you a little bit about Mariah. So, Mariah graduated from Southern Illinois University with her bachelor's and master's in social work. She holds a PEL school social work license, which is needed in Illinois to do schoolwork. She's an LCSW in Illinois, and she also is licensed in Texas. She, like me, has a background in schools, special education, general education. She also does private practice, research, public speaking, and grant funded projects. She currently is in the DFW area in Texas. She has a virtual private practice where we've been talking a little bit about that. She does somatic work and brain spotting. And then she also is passionate about supporting school personnel with accommodations, cultural competency to provide equal access to the curriculum. And she also is the founder of Releve Wellness, right? That's the name of your practice?
Yes.
Awesome. So we have very similar backgrounds, probably, which has brought us to talk about our topic today, which is groups. Why are groups important? I feel like at some point in your career, you might have to run a group or be part of running a group. And why are groups important? But we'll talk about this a little bit more. Groups just provide a very different venue, and it's very different and very similar in some ways, but there are similarities and differences in individual therapy versus group work. There's really important outcomes that clients can have by working in a group. What else about groups? It brings together common issues, right? It helps people feel like, oh, I'm not in this alone. Like I'm doing this with other people. There's some camaraderie there. There's skill building there. There's the social aspect there. And it's cost effective for some people. In a school, obviously kids are not paying for the services, but if you're in private practice, oftentimes groups are offered at a lower fee, or there's community resources that sometimes groups are very low cost or free. So if someone's maybe like, I can't really afford individual therapy at this time, groups could be a nice option to kind of help them with that. Let's go over our learning objectives for today. The first is participants will be able to apply group facilitation skills. After this course, participants will be able to implement at least 3 new strategies to effectively manage group dynamics and foster a supportive environment in group therapy sessions. Number 2, identify the benefits. Participants will be able to identify and describe at least 3 advantages of utilizing group therapy with children. And number 3, utilize virtual platforms for group therapy. Participants will be able to select and utilize appropriate virtual tools and techniques to conduct engaging and effective group therapy sessions online. So, Mariah, thank you for being here today to talk to us about your experience with groups.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about, we were talking kind of before we jumped on to record about working in schools, you kind of get thrown into starting groups. So tell us a little bit about your experience with groups and specifically your work with groups in schools.
So yeah, as Megan said, you really get thrown in, and as we were kind of talking earlier, you don't always think about the fact of how big or how much groups are a part of the job as a school social worker, especially because you're so strapped for time. And so for me, I know I personally have always been more comfortable connecting with people one-on-one, whether that's been professionally or personally. So jumping into groups was a little nerve-wracking for me. I don't really think I had too much experience seeing them being ran when I was in grad school. I also went from being with high schoolers to pre-K through second grade once I got into the field, so that was a big adjustment in itself. But I think the biggest things that were helpful for me was realizing, especially with elementary kids, it's so much more simpler than we make it out to be. And in the schools specifically, it's typically goal oriented when we're talking kids. So it could be, you know, making a friend or learning coping skills or trying to think what else there is. I would say those are the two biggest trends I've seen, right? Would have sorry, those are probably the two types of groups that I've had the most experience with running in schools. And I think the biggest part has been just realizing that, again, with kids, it's so much more simpler than we make it out to be. Just continuing to acquire different resources, and you kind of start to get your system going of what resources you're going to use and recycle. And because kids respond so well to visuals, you end up recycling a lot of the same visuals, and a lot of it really is repetition. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, in schools at least, they're not typically an hour. So that's another thing that can kind of, it's almost like a double-edged sword now that I'm thinking about it. Because at first I was gonna say it almost makes it easier, but sometimes once you really get the going and the group is established, like you might not even realize how quickly 30 minutes will go by. I think what really helped me was networking, becoming a part of different therapist communities, whether they've been on Facebook or in my area, or just touching base with other people that I either went to school with or teachers, learning what kind of resources they use or their styles, because there's no right or wrong way to do any of this. So just kind of navigating your own style. I think even in grad school, I would ask to go shadow other social workers in different settings, or ask if I could see other people. So I think just getting to know other people's styles and the way they do things was helpful. But then also, you find your own rhythm by pulling from different bits of other people's stuff. And then also I think the biggest part is when we first start, you forget to make it fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once I was able to make it fun for kids, it made it fun for me, and it made everyone's lives easier, and the kids were learning. Um, yeah, I guess one other thing I would add, especially in the schools, is that that first semester of school is really more relationship building. Like you probably are not going to meet a goal in the first few weeks, but I know that doesn't apply the same if you've got like a 6 or 8 week group running, but we can also get to that later.
Yeah. In schools, I feel like if you are someone that works in schools or with kids, groups are really essential because they learn best from their peers, right? Like it's a very different setting to be in groups. And also there might be so many kiddos on your caseload that just for time constraints, it's going to be more beneficial for you as the provider to run a group because you can see more kids that way and you might not be able to see them individually. Also, I like that you talked about the short time limited piece of groups in schools. It's very rare. It's awesome if you can, but it's very rare you're going to get a whole hour block to work with kiddos just because of the school day. So I agree, like short and to the point. This might be a lunch bunch, or you pull them, during more free time or more independent learning time, because it is going to be something to consider is when are the kids available and how can you run the group based on who has what times open. So
Mhm.
that's a big piece too, is scheduling can be tricky in a school where you're not necessarily dictating when they are available to come in and run these things. So that's something to consider too. So I wanted to quickly touch on this quote. It says, but I can't run a group. So there's this quote: what stops individual therapists from adding the modality of group therapy to their repertoire of clinical interventions? And then it says here, you can see, although some of these barriers are structural, many are psychological. So this is an article that it's called Terrified of Group Therapy. And what this article talked about is that many practitioners are just frankly have barriers that are, I can't do this. This seems too overwhelming. I don't know how to run groups. So I just wanted to ask you, Mariah, what do you think when you hear that a lot of times people have these mental blocks? A lot of providers might want to run groups, but it seems too daunting or it seems too big, and just kind of your thoughts on that.
Um, I mean, I can relate to it. I get it. And I think the best way to overcome it is, well, when you're put in a position to just jump into it, like a lot of things. But I agree, a lot of it is psychological, because especially if you're in social work and you choose to go like the therapy based route, because there are so many ways to go. At least I'm gonna speak on my behalf. I think when I think about therapy, I think about individual, and it
Mhm.
didn't even really cross my mind how much I was going to have to do groups. So it's just one of those things you didn't consider, or you may have not paid so much attention to at some point, or like when you were learning. So it's very easy. Like I like the analogy of like if you haven't seen someone swimming in the waters and it's safe, like you get a little nervous to know whether or not it's safe over there. But once you're seeing that, oh, it's safe over there, even just kind of almost be thrown into it and you figure out how to be safe in it and survive in it, then you figure it out. And I think the biggest thing, I go back to making it fun. And another one of the things I think about that helped me with the blocks was like, okay, what is the purpose of this? Like going back to thinking about it a little bit more objectively. What is the purpose and how can I teach this effectively?
Mhm.
Do you want me to go a little bit into that?
Sure.
Okay, I think the biggest thing that helped me to make this fun for me, but also figuring out effectiveness when I started running groups was I was like, okay, I could like treat this as almost like a little mini social experiment. Like, let me think about the different personalities of these kids as I've started to get to know them, as I've started to, watch them interact with peers in the, non-structural and structural settings, kind of what I've learned from both parents and teachers. And based on that, as as accessible as it can be, or as much as I can, depending on accessibility, timing, and all of that, I try to pair kids with other kids who might rub off on each other or bring out parts in them that they might need some support or pulling out of. So like I might try to make sure that there's a leader in the group. I might try to make sure there's someone that's a little bit more reserved and grounded and might even need someone to kind of pull them out their shell. I have like the really extroverted, outgoing, they might be a little silly, but then they've got they've got their leader and they've got the other more reserved and grounded person to kind of even it out. It doesn't always work out that way, but when you can kind of, I say when you can kind of play Tetris with the
Mhm.
particular groups, it is kind of fun to see how all of the different kids respond differently, depending on the dynamic. And I think that can have a huge effect on the outcomes of the group as well.
Yeah, I like that you talked about like the different personalities, and that's something to consider. So when you're running a group, you shouldn't just pick at random, right?
Mhm.
Unless you are forced to do that. But you got to really think of these different things. And what's interesting is you might not know this until you get going in the group, right? So you might have a couple weeks and you're like, wow, like I didn't really notice this is how the dynamic was going to be. And a lot of people took maybe a group class in grad school, but groups really do go through those different stages, right? Where they're forming, and then we have norming, and then we have storming. It all happens even with if you're working with groups and young children. So just things to consider is what are the group dynamics, and you might not know that until you get going in it, but how are you going to manage those group dynamics, I think, is really important as well. um I have a kind of quick turn in the topic. Have you run virtual groups? You might have been forced to in COVID because that
Yep.
was kind of the way, but how do virtual groups run differently from in person? And what are some things to consider there?
Ooh, okay. So just a little backstory. I started working in the field fall of 2019. So I spent about 6 or 8 months in person before COVID happened. And so I had very brief experience being in person. And honestly, for me, I think because online there's just more you can do, or I'm not gonna say more you can do on a computer, but sometimes you kind of got used to it. You got adjusted. And I think I got adjusted and comfortable to screen sharing and finding games and stuff. And so I think based on where I started, I got a little comfortable with the online groups. However, I knew it wasn't sustainable having like first graders running around the room and just just trying to keep them engaged, and a lot of it was really just bringing them together. And didn't I mean, like, I look back at it now and it's like, man, that was so much more important and a part of the goal than I realized. Like, sometimes it's just a matter of getting kids together and having them in a room to be able to get along and, have conversations with other kids. It goes back to sometimes it's just that simple, like, especially like a social skills group. Like, as
Mhm.
long as you can facilitate, bring them together and they're having a turn taking conversation about something, you've done your job. And that's why I'm like, it's so important to think about the fun ways to do it. And so I think to answer your question about the challenges, based on where I started, like I said, I think I enjoyed the online part because I was getting comfortable with it. And it was almost a challenge to come back and figure out how I wanted to revamp this in person. Because honestly, when I started those first 6 to 8 months, I felt like I was still running around with a chicken with my head cut off. It was my first year in special education. I had pre-K through second grade versus gen ed high school. So there was just a lot of changes happening for me and I was figuring it out in person. And I feel like I felt more confident in the figuring out phase online. So I think once we came back to in person, I was also with a new district at this point. It was so funny to one see these little kids. I'm like, oh my gosh, they come up to my hip. They're so tiny, and you're used to seeing them on a screen. But I think having, at least for me, this is a very unique time. I think it was nice to be able to experience both and kind of figure out some of the ways that I could use media in groups as well. But then it was also, again, nice, especially with the younger kids, to have those tangible things, like your fidgets and your games. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And what's really cool is some people from the pandemic have actually started really successful practices with kids and just with general population that are all virtual. So some people have really found this as an area that really works for them. And I will say, um, now that we are, I don't want to say we're post pandemic, but we are moving in that direction, right? I'm seeing a lot more clients to say, I want to give virtual a try again. I think we really burnt out from being on Zoom a lot, and a lot of kids had really negative ideas like, "Oh, I don't wanna even think about doing things again on Zoom," but now I'm starting to see now that they're a little bit older, I mean, right, the pandemic started 4 years ago, they're more willing to try virtual or give it a try again because it's not what we do every single day, right? They're not a lot of times, they're not going to school all day on the computer, so I've seen that now there's kind of a shift the other way where kids are like and teens are more like, I'm willing to give it a try again."
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, I like some of the virtual things too. Some kids really thrive. What are some ways you saw in the virtual setting that maybe kids that wouldn't feel comfortable in person or felt more comfortable in their home setting? What are some benefits you saw of for some children of doing groups virtually?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. So one of the first things I think of is how I think about kids on the autism spectrum. So I know when we came back in person, we had to have those masks on,
Yeah.
which for safety. But during COVID, when we were online, it was helpful for them to be able to see facial expressions and all that kind of stuff. Like if we were online. And then some kids, you've got those kids that've got some social anxiety, and it's already one thing to be around the group, but if they can be in the comfort of their own home while they're trying to navigate, having, turn taking conversations and building their social skills, it can kind of bring a different level of comfort.
Mm,
I think about myself sitting on the other side of the couch quite literally. Like I could do therapy like I could see my therapist on my couch.
mhm.
And I think there's something about just being in the comfort of your own home that helps you to kind of process and get more comfortable about what you're speaking about, and maybe even going further than what you would have gone if you were in a setting outside of the comfort of your own home.
I very much agree with that. Kids specifically can grab a stuffy or something that like will help them in a virtual setting, or it's a double-edged sword, right? Sometimes they feel comfortable and then other times maybe they're too comfortable where you're like, okay, come back to the camera, we
Right?
gotta do our stuff. But I do think for some kiddos it's great. And then I know a lot of my work with parents has complete, like I very rarely have parents come in for particularly parenting work because we can now do it virtually. So I've actually even done some groups with parents that it's just much more convenient for lifestyle purposes to do it virtually, right? Like
Yes.
not going to come into my office and do it when we can just, I mean, how much do we utilize Zoom now where we're like, let me just jump on a Zoom call with you. So there's that accessibility piece that I think is really important too. So I think there's definitely a place for virtual groups, and there's also a lot now where there's gaming groups, and it depends on what type of group you're running, right? Is it more of like a social group? Is it more of a skills-based group? Is it more of a processing or a therapeutic group? All important things to think about when you're planning for a group. What is the purpose of your group and what are you trying to get out of it? I think that's just for someone that's new to groups, important things to consider is what are you trying to get out of the group, and what is the goal that someone participating in that group would be working towards. So I want to move to our next piece that comes from that same article. These are some strategies it says to build confidence. If you're like, oh, I want to run a group, but it seems really intimidating. I don't have the skills. And Mariah, you and I can like go through each of these, and maybe I'll take some and you can take some, but we'll just talk about how we in working with kids and in running groups have kind of used some of these strategies to build our own confidence. So the first one is seeking training and supervision. Um, it's essential, right? You need training, you need supervision. I know that you said that when you first started, you were utilizing, peers and networking a lot. So tell me a little bit how you have used supervisors or supervision or mentors in helping you build that confidence when you're working with kiddos in a group setting.
I think one of the biggest things, and I guess you can never reach out too much, especially if you're unsure. But I feel like I was calling somebody almost every day because in the beginning, because like I said, there was so much newness for me in my experience. And so a lot of the times it would be as little as like, how do I respond to this thing? But it's like there's a difference in the way you might respond to something with an individual versus when you're in a group.
Mhm.
So I think just, constantly calling on those people. And again, I think I even mentioned earlier, like if there are opportunities to shadow someone, do that. Like my
Yeah.
school social work job, I had the privilege of having a second school social worker in the building. And so she allowed me to shadow her to see how she does groups. She shared a ton of resources with me because she was pretty seasoned. So those were things that really that alone like helped me a ton in the beginning. Like I don't know how I mean, we always figured things out, but I couldn't imagine like what that may have looked like if I didn't have another social worker in the building. I think even also getting to know the kids' learning styles helps a lot too. And starting to, this is something I learned in grad school, but there might be a kid who might be resistant to doing or to expressing whatever it is that you're asking for them in a group. And it could be something that's written and it's like, okay, if you're not comfortable writing, you can talk it out or you can draw it out. Like, you can decide what mode of communication you want to express this. So I think giving a lot of that power of choice, without giving too many choices. I always stick to like two or three, depending on the situation, the age, all those types of things. And then I think also just, calling on the kids. Like, what do you all want to get out of this? Um,
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing because then that turns into that client self-determination and especially with kids and you're gonna get a lot of the power struggles throughout the time with both individuals and especially groups. I've noticed because sometimes, I mean, a lot of the times people are different depending on the dynamic they're in. So putting that power back in their hands, I think even just starting, I think we talked about establishing group norms just a little bit. But in the beginning, coming up with some expectations, letting them come up with them, but also having in the back of your head, okay, what are like my three ones that I want to make sure we're on the same page on? And for me, it's like making sure there's respect for one another. Everything stays here. And then what's the third one? I have a third one. It might just be to have fun. I think that really is the one.
Yeah.
But I think establishing those in the beginning, but again, letting them take the front seat first, but kind of having it in the back of your mind to kind of weave it into the conversation as you guys are developing that can be a really powerful way to build rapport and some foundation to the group. Trying to think what else. What was the original question, Megan?
How you utilize training and supervision. And you were saying how you really could not have run groups without that support.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the biggest thing was just leaning, or I mean, again, like I had, someone in my building I could kind of watch. And then for me, even like we're amongst a ton of teachers. So even just observing the ways that teachers facilitate
Yeah.
their classroom sometimes, I feel like I would learn from them, especially if you're in a classroom and you see the way that a teacher rounds up their class when they need you to, or they need the kids to be quiet. It's like, okay, note it, because that's something they already know how to respond to. So just getting to know, I think, especially the classroom and the school norms will help a lot with figuring out how you can run effective groups as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece too. Lean on who you have, and teachers are a wonderful resource. They have to or pull smaller groups throughout the day, so that's a really good resource to utilize if you are in the school setting. I'll talk a little bit about self-reflection and awareness. This is essential to any type of work that clinicians, mental health practitioners do, but you have to if you are fearful of this or something's holding you back, address that, right? What is it? What is that kind of feeling that's like I want to do this but I'm not really confident? Make sure that you're aware of it, right? By avoiding it, that's never going to move us forward. And then if you always got to figure out what your implicit biases are, be self-aware of your limitations, your strengths, your weaknesses. And I think that's really important for anything, like I said, in mental health work. But if you are kind of feeling like I don't know if I'm ready to take the step to do groups, what is holding you back and kind of addressing that, because that might be helpful when you're self-aware, you can actually make the steps towards doing or working towards something that might be helpful to get you out of that comfort zone and maybe push you a little bit forward. We talked about the building a support network, right? You said that that's really essential. And as a mental health practitioner, you should always be networking and building your support network. Have people in your network that are in your court, that are your cheerleaders, right? This could be colleagues, this could be mentors, and this doesn't necessarily have to be only mental health practitioners, right? I have many times asked teachers, hey, what do you think of this? I've asked OTs, I've asked speech therapists, I've even asked medical professionals. So your support network doesn't necessarily have to just be, mental health practitioners, other social workers. It can be broad. I'll ask you a little bit about this one, Mariah. Starting small, how would you encourage someone to maybe build your way up to being a group expert? We kind of were forced to start small, but this could be co-facilitating. But how would you encourage like getting your feet a little bit wet with groups if you're interested in this?
So again, I'm going to speak specifically on the school setting, because I know that a lot of other settings you don't always have unless it's private and that's, you have control over it, but sometimes we don't have control over the amount of kids that we're going to have in a group. But I guess also it's going to depend on how many kids are on your caseload, all those types of things. But if you can, and if it's accessible, starting with like 2 to 3 kids in a group,
Hmm.
um, 2 would be ideal, but 3 was honestly realistic in my experience. And I think 2, I tried, like, if I could, I would do 2. And if I did 2, it was like, if I had 2 kids that were just bouncing off the walls, like, I'm like, I know I can only do 2 or else I'm gonna get overwhelmed and we're probably not gonna get a whole lot out of this because we're not regulated.
Right.
Um, but for the most part, it was groups of 3s. If I know I had like a older elementary group that were fairly mature and like, they were depending on, feedback I've heard and they all get along. I think that's another thing, knowing who does and doesn't get along.
Mhm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean don't put them in a group, but it's learning what is the extent to that and is this an opportunity to teach them conflict resolution.
Yeah.
Um, could be a whole nother conversation, but I think those are great ways to start small. And it goes back to, just playing around. How do these 2 work together? Okay, now that I got these 2 comfortable, maybe I could throw this next one in because this group could use a little bit more of this, or there's a kid who needs this that's in the same age range. So again, a lot of that's, I feel like a lot of the ability to start small really depends on your caseload too.
Yeah,
Um,
and what you have available, right? Like you said, sometimes you
yes,
don't have anything available. It is what it is, but there could be cases where maybe you have a co-facilitator.
yeah,
Maybe there's 2 people, or maybe it's not even a co-facilitator, but maybe it's just like an aide or someone, an extra set of hands and eyes, because if you're working with kids, it can get kind of rowdy. And
absolutely.
a second set of hands just can be really helpful sometimes.
Yeah, and and a lot of the schools that I've worked in, not all of them, but if you have the privilege of having both a counselor and a school social
Mhm.
worker, it can be beneficial to co-facilitate with one another in that way as well. And sometimes that can look like a group, or I mean, like a classroom setting too. Like I've gone into classrooms and done like a co-facilitated SEL lesson with the counselor.
Yeah.
And it just, it's effective because we've got 2 set of hands. Like if we have kids break out, we can both be going around the room and assisting, or popping into the different groups. So that's something that I've really enjoyed too in my experience with groups.
Yeah, glad that you said you can even go into the classroom, because it is actually more of a psychoeducation group, but I have done whole class lessons, right? So that's a very large group. But there's been times where a teacher's like, "Hey, can you come in and talk about conflict resolution?" And the teacher might tag team with me, and that's where that support, that, making sure you have those strong relationships with staff so that teachers know their kids really well. So they were able to help with some of the classroom management pieces, and I was able to share my expertise on a particular topic. So utilize what you have, right? Utilize what you have. And there might even be some opportunities where your group is running and you notice someone in the group kind of wants to be a leader in the group, right? Or maybe you're running the group several times throughout the year and they become kind of the veteran because they've done this before. So utilize what you have, and sometimes that's just literally using someone already within the school, or utilizing the kiddos themselves to really take ownership and leadership within the group setting. So there's a lot of
Absolutely.
ways you can do this. This is something I actually this is an art, utilizing your personal experience. So some
Hey,
people,
Megan,
yeah,
can I touch on something from the
yeah,
self-reflection and awareness?
go ahead.
I was like in agreement with you as far as the, stopping and addressing things as they come up. And I think that's such a huge part of burnout prevention too.
Hmm.
Because, things are going to come up and I think it's really important, or important and valuable, every time, you find yourself having some transference or getting emotionally charged when, something comes up within, whether it be an individual student or something in the group, like stopping yourself and asking, like, what's coming up for me? Like, what's familiar about this? And have I worked, or how did I, or have I not worked through this? And what
Yeah.
do I need to do to work through this? And, that goes back to, finding your own therapist. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think that is a way that I've seen, well, both experience and seen a lot of people get jaded is when you don't take the opportunities to be still and see what's coming up for you before you move forward to try to continue services with the kid or with the group.
I really appreciate that you brought that up because it's essential, but oftentimes we don't have the time to do it or we don't put it aside the time. So just a nice reminder to do that because this work is hard. So if you're
Mhm.
not taking the time to reflect and be self-aware, that's when you do see the burnout and you're not going to be as effective as you could be. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So something I was just touching on is utilizing personal experience. A lot of times people new to the field ask me this, like, I don't want to overstep a boundary. I want to be very professional, but I'm someone that, in a therapeutic, appropriate, clinical way, I do use my personal experiences, right? And for me, you don't want to share all of your personal details with your clients, but I tell clients, I was your age before, right? I have been a middle schooler before. So I try to utilize my personal experience to as a way to connect with my students. I'd be curious, Mariah, how I think with kids you have to have that vulnerability and be able to connect that way, but how have you potentially like talked about your own personal experiences to connect with the kiddos that you work with?
I would say a lot of the same ways that you were saying, but I will say I think it really depends on the age group and the context. But very much like, and I think also there's an advantage to being younger. And I remind them, I'm like, it wasn't that long ago that I was your age. You know that, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the times that kind of brings them back to, okay, she actually knows. Or sometimes, like, again, like I don't tell them all of my business and details, but there are sprinkles of information that they know about me. So I might be like, yeah, like I might connect with them on something that my little cousin likes that they both like, or someone that I'm really close with. And I might even show them pictures to kind of humanize myself. And that's my comfort level. I know that's going to
Yep.
be different for everybody. I'm trying to think what else. Or even, there's a zones chart I use for checking in with kids every week during groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I have everyone point out what zone they're currently in. And then I ask the group, I typically will do it and most of the kids say yes, but I'll ask them, I'm like, do you guys want me to let you know what zone I'm in every day too? And they
Yeah.
usually do, and I'll be very honest with them. I mean, of course, I'm not telling them the adult details of all my feelings, but it's like, if I'm tired, I'm like, I didn't sleep well last night. Like, I'm really tired today, so I'm moving a little slower today. But you know what? But then I also try to model the things that I'm doing to supplement or support myself in that moment, and I think that's great for them to see as well. Then
Yeah.
we do highs and lows. So I have the kids tell me about a high or good news, something that made them happy since the last time we spoke. A low, meaning like something that might have been difficult or a big feeling that they had, and then how they work through it. And then we'll talk about what they might be able to do differently. That kind of comes into the coping skill conversation. And then depending on time, we might talk about something they might be looking forward to, but that doesn't always come up. But even with those questions that I ask them, I answer them as well. And, I don't always like initiate or ask if they want it, but oftentimes kids will be like, what about you?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, since you asked, or even if I see kids getting uncomfortable, or in the beginning, if they're unclear of what highs and lows are, I'm like, do you guys want me to go first? And they
Yeah.
really like that. And it gives them an idea. They're like, oh, well, in that case, and then they start telling me whatever, they start talking and processing on whatever it was that was there that they just didn't have the language for, the example for before sharing it with everyone.
Yeah, I think that for me personally, everyone's gonna have their own comfort zone, like you said, but I'm pretty straightforward with like my personal experience. They're like, what was middle school like for you? And I tell them, right? I'm very open because for me, that helps build that rapport. It helps them see at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? We have feelings. And sometimes they're curious and sometimes I have to set a boundary. I'm like, I'm not gonna answer that type of thing. But a lot of times it's mostly because they just want to connect with you in some way. And
Yeah.
like for example, I love Harry Potter, so I have Harry Potter stuff in my office, and we'll talk about, oh, when I read Harry Potter, or I had a Harry Potter movie marathon this weekend. Find little ways that you can connect with the people in your group in an appropriate way, right? But and be self-aware. Like this, you have to, as the facilitator of the group, be self-aware that you're not utilizing this group as a time to process your own stuff, right? Like there's a time and a place for this, and you don't want to overstep those boundaries or blur the lines. So you have to be very aware of what your role is and like where the bounds of are where it becomes inappropriate to share certain things. So that's just kind of a comfort thing, and it comes with knowing the group, knowing yourself, which ties us into our last point of be vulnerable, right? I
Oh,
think
can I add something?
yeah, of course.
I'm thinking about things that we disclose in our likes and interests. And, as you're getting to know kids, you get to know the things they like. And,
Yeah.
in elementary school, I'm thinking about something I'm looking at right now, but liking Pokemon is not uncommon. And so, I mean, I'm not into Pokemon now, but it's something I was really into as a kid. And I still have like a booklet of some of my like favorite Pokemon cards. And I'll be like, I used to love Pokemon when I was your age too. Like, would you like it if I brought in my cards and, we could talk about the different characters and, who's your favorite? Like, do you play outside of this? So it's like just having those little nuggets of ways to build a rapport with them. And it's also a really cool opportunity to get back in touch with your child self.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm all about play, right? And that's what I think is so much fun about working with kids is like you get to have that playful side, right? I too, I'm like, I had Pokemon and I don't I ask them, they get to be the experts on some things and then I add details as well. And it's just a really nice experience for everyone to see that this person that is older still can be playful with me and still cares and can still connect on my level.
Yes, absolutely.
That really brings us into our last point, which is be vulnerable, and that's part of being vulnerable, right? Is knowing, being aware, bringing yourself to the relationship, um, and being empathetic. I tell my kids I was in middle school. I know I was a middle schooler. It's hard, right? I get it. And I think that sometimes they don't want to hear that, right? You don't understand anything, which sometimes I don't. I've not been in that person's shoes, but I have been a 13-year-old in middle school before. So just those type of things, being vulnerable. Um, Also, I don't know about how you feel about this, Mariah, but I feel like a lot of times in grad school, we were taught to not be vulnerable at all, right? Like you just have
Mhm.
to keep it business as usual, be very professional. And I think that a lot of times that can prevent us from really getting into the therapeutic relationship in ways that are helpful. So I'm always about like be vulnerable in ways that feel comfortable, but we are humans at the end of the day, so we have to be vulnerable.
Yes. I agree. Yeah, I was gonna say, I know at least for myself, like that was probably the most anxiety ridden things for me, like going
Mhm.
through grad school. I'm like, how am I supposed to do? Like, I almost felt like I was being taught to be a robot. And then I got out and I was still trying to operate in robot mode, but it wasn't working.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it was like, I'm like, okay, let me try something different. And I think especially when I got to my second job, which was a lot more busy, and intense compared to the first one I had, I had to, and there was also, it wasn't as, what's the word? There weren't as many resources and things in general were just not done like, by the book or the way that things are supposed to be done, quote unquote. So there was a lot of improvising and learning how to make myself human
Mm.
in those situations and realizing like, oh man, when I like humanize myself, I'm actually a lot more effective and the kids are more connected to me.
I 100% agree with that, and I think when I kind of let go of that, like, I have to be a certain way, I can't be myself,
Mm-hmm.
I really came into my own way and found, like, I like being playful, I that's what makes my job fun, right, is getting to share these little pieces, and especially with kids, they can pick up on this, they will tell me sometimes, I've seen someone, they were so boring, like, right, they want to connect and find ways to connect with them, but still be authentic to yourself. When you're not authentic or disingenuine with kids, they can pick up on it immediately.
Yep.
So these actually, like we've talked about real life examples, but these are things that I think make someone a good group facilitator. So things to keep in mind, especially if you're just feeling like I don't have that confidence to make the jump into group therapy. I think it can be really helpful. We'll go ahead and move into starting to think about wrapping up. But my last question I'll ask you, Mariah, is what has been your favorite group to run, and why?
Ooh, that's a big question. I also, wait, I'm gonna answer it, but there's another thing I wanted to touch on that I think wasn't really built in here, but it was like and let me know which one you want me to answer first, but, working with, like, having, like, a challenging kid within a group setting
Mhm.
and how to address it, I was thinking about a specific experience to bring up in the conversation, so I can come back to that one. But can you remind me what the question is that you were just asking me?
Favorite group you've run and why?
Favorite group I've run? Ooh, can it be like, does it have to be a particular, particular group of kids in that group, or just, like, the
No,
type?
whatever sticks out to you as something that was memorable.
Um I think in hindsight, my favorites were the social skills ones that like started online during COVID and poured into coming back during the school year.
Yeah.
And I think in the moment, it was very stressful for me because these are like kindergarten, first grade, special education kids who all have these like social skills or coping skill goals. And again, it goes back to thinking that you have to do so much more than you do. And I think even like the challenges are the ones that ended up being my favorite because I get to turn around and I'm like, wait, I actually did my job. But I
Yeah.
think about one group in particular. They had to be a mix of kindergarten and first grade. I had one kid who would not sit still for anybody's class, was very defiant, really funny kid. So it was hard to keep face while he was doing all this. Dad had a hard time in the background, like we're online, right? So kid would be up and down, running around the room, just doing his thing. But he would sit down for me for a little bit, and me and dad would talk a lot. And I remember dad, one of our conversations, he's like, he does so well with you. Like he doesn't sit as long for you as he does anybody. And I'm like, this kid sits with me for 5 minutes, if that. But
And
to
that
me,
was progress, it sounds like.
it was, and I didn't realize it. And another, like, I think speaking point to it was coming back. I think one, as the group got facilitated, all the kids starting to get comfortable to have conversation or share their input on different topics or things that we were doing. So that was cool. And then the one kid that I was just referring to, the one that was running around the room rampant during our groups and real defiant, when I got to his IEP meeting, his goal was, I think, was just to identify how he was feeling. I think it was to identify his feelings. And the psychologist, mind you, I'm new to this team. Like I started during COVID, and a lot of these people have been working together for years, so they've seen these kids before. I'm just meeting these kids in person. But the psychologist was like, well, when I met with him to assess him, she was like, he can identify his feelings, which is huge for him. And it's like you don't always think about how big that is because you're so focused on trying to make it effective or do something right. But it's like you just being there and creating a safe, unconditional, inviting space, and a place for mutual respect between you and kids goes so much further than you realize.
Yeah, that is the therapeutic power right there. Is them
Yeah,
I think of that a lot now that I'm in private practice, is just that relationship is the therapy, right? Like, yes, we can do these modalities and stuff, and that's great, but if we don't have the base of the feeling comfortable and feeling like I can trust you, you're not going to get anywhere. I
exactly.
love that you talked about like it can be challenging and you gotta, that's the hardest part is when there's maybe someone that is having a hard time in the group. You have to think on your feet and be able to
Mhm.
manage that. And that I will say does take some skill and some practice. And if you feel completely overwhelmed at first, it will get easier.
It does, and each situation is gonna be different too, because that's not even the one that I was thinking of bringing up again, at first, I forgot that there was that challenge, I was just thinking about a goal, but, what was I gonna say? Oh, I think about a conversation I recently had with one of my supervisees, and she's just now getting into a lot of the direct work, and she works in a juvenile, detention center, and she was at first really fixated on learning certain modalities, and I was like, girl, throw that away for a second. I was like, this is what you need to keep in mind. And I know like one of her intentions with being in supervision was learning how to do therapy. And it's like, it's great to learn about these modalities, but first, let's figure out how to make people feel safe,
Mhm.
heard, seen, and connected. And once you have those things, you can start diving into the modalities. But without those things, the modalities really don't mean anything.
Exactly.
Um,
And you could be trained in a million different modalities. That doesn't make you a good therapist.
agreed. Agreed.
I will give I'll end here with just one of my favorite groups that I ran. It was in a special education classroom, early childhood, so very similar to yours. And I would come in 3 times a week, and I was on their schedule to do social skills 3 times a week. And the kids started to look forward to it. We had a little stuffed animal that would come for social skills, and that became part of their routine. And just having the kids look forward to me coming, and like I said, we had the stuffed animal, they got to name the stuffed animal that came. That was my favorite because it just showed how we could build a community, and it doesn't have to be this big production. It was just me coming in for 15 to 20 minutes to really talk about skills they were probably already doing, but doing it in a fun way. So that was like one of my favorite is it went on for the whole school year. It was my favorite part too because they would run up and be so excited to see me. And if
Mhm.
if the schedule changed because it's schools, the schedule changed. They're like, I'm so sad we didn't have social skills group yesterday, but they really do start to look forward to it. And it's those moments that I think when they're asking for it or when can we do it or I'm so excited to do this is when you're like, wow, this really is powerful work that we're doing.
Agreed. Or even when like they come back and they're like, so I was thinking about what we did last week, or I was going through this and I thought about this, like when they connect dots of how they took away something from group and how they applied it in real life. That is the most rewarding thing ever. Or like I know, like at least for me with social work, like there's not actual homework assignments, but I'll give like, it may be a good idea for you to. I encourage you to use this resource that we talked about or practice this thing, and like I don't always keep them accountable to it initially. I might ask about it somewhere down the line, but just to have kids like the minute they see me, they're like, I did the homework, and like they're just excited to tell me that they worked on it and what came of it. And that is just so fulfilling for me.
I agree. So I used to be someone that said I would never do groups, and look here, we're talking about how much fun we've had doing them and how successful they were to kids. So don't count yourself out of being a group facilitator. There's a lot of power in running groups.
Yes, agreed. I don't know if we have time, but can I bring up the one challenging situation I was going to refer to?
Yes, of course.
I think about, it's very common that you might have a kid in a group that may give you a hard time, especially in a group setting. And, I don't know, well, I don't know where people are starting, but there's the whole, attention seeking, but reframing it to connection seeking. And
Yep.
so I think about a particular time, and this was a breakthrough moment for me because now I've done it ever since, or I've found ways to incorporate it. But I had a kid who was just he had to be fifth grade. Yeah, fifth grade. Very I don't know if clownish would be the word. He could be a little bit of clownish, a little bit defiant, kind of, mouthy, but it was kind of in a way to show off to friends. Also, just
Mhm.
was very distracting to the group. And I would try to redirect or do some planned ignoring, and eventually, you got to be careful to make sure you're not losing your cool because the kids sometimes feed on
Yep.
that. But I realized, like, just from listening to the ways that the other adults in the building talk about him and treat him, I'm like, he's used to people thinking of him as a problem child. And I was like, let me chill out. And I pulled him aside at the end. I was like, hey, it seems like you're having a hard time in group right now. So, for the next few weeks, let's just meet one on one and get to know each other. Cause I know we're still fairly new. And when it seems like it's a good time, we can talk about going back to the group. He was fine with it. And really, that's all he really needed. Like, he was a little quiet in the beginning. And as I got to talk to him, I realized this kid really had a lot, like, his self-confidence and esteem was really low. He was motivated to do like he wanted responsibilities. I got to learn about who he was as a person, and I got to treat him as a kid that a lot of adults in the building didn't treat him as. And I think just having one person treat you as your best self goes so far for kids. And we probably only did that for maybe 3 weeks. And I was like, what do you think about group? And like, he had really grown to like being together. I was like, we can still check in one on one here and there, but it won't be every week. But what do you think about joining the group again? Like, it seems like, we're on a good page and we were able to move forward from there. And I think even during the time together, we talked about what challenges might come up in group if he had any, clashes or, anything come up with other kids in the group. Cause, you got the things that go on in school and outside of school on the internet that we don't know about. So it's like just getting all the information to kind of know what other things to consider or if there's things going on at home. So it's kind of like you have an idea of like when something starts to seem a little out of balance with the kid too.
Yeah,
Um,
and
yeah,
that goes back to that relationship building. If you didn't have that relationship with that kid, it wouldn't have probably ended the way that you just described.
yes. Absolutely. And another, I was going to say, especially those power struggle kids we talked about a little bit, but giving them some responsibility, giving them some jobs. Maybe you need to make them feel like a leader. Like, hey, since we talked about this one on one, how do you feel about, kind of leading this when we bring it up in the group next week? And kind of
Yeah.
letting them kind of feel like they have some power, I think is really important with kids too, that you might be having a hard time within groups otherwise.
Yeah, giving them power, giving them leadership and utilizing, like I said, utilizing what you have to make it a powerful experience.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, of course, as always, thank you, Mariah. We have some resources here if people are interested. Obviously, we focused in on kids today, but there's groups are effective in a variety of different things. They're used with adults, substance use disorders, they're used for eating disorders, they can be used for identity groups. There are a variety of different things, but we were really focusing in today on work with kiddos and the power of groups there. So go ahead and check these out if you're interested. And of course, as always, I want to thank you, Mariah, for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. And I can always talk about schools and kiddos all day long. So thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
And if you are tuning in, you will need to complete your quiz and you will also need to complete your evaluation to earn your CE credits. So make sure that you do this after listening to our webinar today. And once again, Mariah, thank you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.